fy.com.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and do the players model now. So in the players, we had the same goal with a little bit of a wrinkle, right? So on the player side, when I save a player now, I've got to do a couple things, right? One is, if you look at this model, player belongs to a team, and he belongs to a roster. So I've got to get them both in there, okay? So the first thing we're going to do with the player, and let's just do the same thing we did last time. We'll model it out and say, player has a name of A. We'll just do the other fields because we don't really care about those. But it'll have a team, no team, right? When we start out. And we want it to end up with name A, team, whatever, blah, 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 and roster of blah, blah, blah. That needs to happen. And also what needs to happen is in the rosters database, you need to have, so the roster that's ID of whatever needs to have players, and one of those players is going to be our player. Let's just say our ID is 1, 2, 3. Like that. So both things have to happen here, right? We need to make sure we have a valid team that we're looking in, that we're trying to add ourselves to, okay? And the query, and the way we're going to add this in will look something like this. We'll do, let's see. So we'll do Zach, and at the end here we'll do something like team. I'll leave it blank for now. We'll get a team ID in a second. Actually, let's just go ahead and do it now. Look in Mongo for a team. Teams.find. So let's do the purple team. That. Okay, so we're going to eventually add Zach to this purple team, and that should in turn create rosters and everything else for us as we go through. I'm not going to hit enter yet because I know this won't work. And I don't want to duplicate his record. So let's go ahead and go to the database where I can do players db.players.remove. So we start Zach fresh. Okay, so what has to happen to make all this work? What are the steps we need to follow here? I'll just list them out. So in order to go from this to this, a couple things need to happen. One is we're going to post a name, right? Actually, I'm lying. I should actually put this up here because you're going to have a team. We're going to say post to this team, okay? So the first thing we want to do is make sure is that team valid, right? Okay, and yes. Then what do we do? What's the roster for the team, right? Get the roster ID from the team. Now, we know from earlier, teams will always have a roster. So we're going to make some assumptions here that the team has a roster. Can't create it without a roster. So we're going to get a roster ID from the team. Okay. Then we're going to say, store the team ID and the roster ID on me. Add me to the roster. Those are your basic steps here, okay? That should turn this into both of these, okay? Make sense? All right, let's do it. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to get the model for team in here. So we're going to say const team equals require teams. Rosters. And we know we've got a team ID, so we're going to say team.find by ID this team, which is coming in with the post command, right? Then I have a team, hopefully, right?
You want to do the other way, where it's, if the team's null, we'll handle that first, like we did last time.
Right, so in here we're going to say if not team, right?
Okay.
So we're going to say,
Oh,
I'm inside the then, right? So if not team, do something, and that do something needs to be return, promise, reject, right? Because technically we're in the then, we're gonna try and call the catch here. If I don't have a valid team, just get out. Make sense? What's that?
It kicks you out of it.
Yep, just kicks me out.
Could we,
And the catch, because down here you're gonna have the same as before. We're gonna have a dot then, which calls the done, and a dot catch runs done. And so we want to make sure that this falls into here. Okay. Else?
this wouldn't make a team if it didn't exist.
No, we're not making a team that doesn't exist. We're assuming that you know what you're doing here. This is kind of a thing where, again, I'm picturing in my mind a screen where I have a drop-down list of teams with IDs, and I'm hooking it up, right?
Gotcha. That's why it's different than the last team.
Exactly right. So otherwise, now I've got a good ID, right? So I'm going to say this team equals team.id, which is what I for sure want to do, right? Then we want to say, do I have a roster? So the roster for the team, right? What I'm going to say is this dot roster equals team roster. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
So if I just saved this is all that I did. I'm going to say return promise.resolve. This ought to just give me my pointers and nothing else. I should have, let's just go to Zach, db.find.players. What's that?
Yeah, there's no player.
Yeah, I know. db.players.find. Nothing. So if I go to my Zach, I got a valid team ID, which I pulled out of here, right? Purple is a real team. Bad request. What did we do here? Unexpected token. What? Oh, my JSON bad?
Team's not in.
Yep, that's right. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I have a team ID now. What I don't have is I don't have the team roster. What is
Because
that?
you made this dot team equal just the ID. Now you're trying to get the
Oh.
from that.
Well, I've got this dot team is the ID, so that's what I sent in, right? I'm not sure that I'm actually in this code here, though. And I want to go back here and delete my player. Add him again. Let's see. See, I never got in there. Just see what's happening. Make sure we're wired. Not getting in. Pre-save. Getting desperate, right? It happens. I must have like 10 Zachs in here now, right? Yeah.
A team full of Zachs.
Schema. Pre-save. That may be why. Haha, there we go. Now we're good. So you see what I did there?
You put the exported stuff.
Yeah, it exported stuff that didn't exist yet, right? So it exported, and then I was creating stuff after that. So shame on me. And now, of course, I'm hanging because of that player exists 35 times, and he can't. So let me go ahead and delete him again out of here, and we'll do this. Hey, adding ID roster blah. I didn't call it done. Never made them. There we go. So Zach now has a roster. And you see what I did there? What did I screw up? What's that? Well, what it's getting, he's getting the whole roster instead of the ID of the roster, right?
Or team.roster.
Because team.roster actually ends up having, it runs that find one block, and it gets them all.
We could do like dot name if you wanted to make it actually look better.
You could. I mean, the point of it is you want to get the IDs to match,
Yeah.
because IDs are the fastest indexing, right? So, okay, let me go ahead and double check. I want to delete him because I don't want to leave it that messy like that. So we'll delete him. There's a lot that we're following here makes sense so far, right? Find the team. If I don't have it, reject. If I do have it, set my ID to the team ID, set roster equals the team.roster, right?
Can you reject by just writing reject?
What's that?
You have to do return promise.reject, or can you just write reject?
I'm not in a promise.
I mean,
Yeah.
online.
Yeah, I've got to return promise that because I don't have a promise here, right? I'm returning.
Since it's a dot then, doesn't a dot then automatically put you into a new promise? Or dot then dot catches?
Yeah. So what I'm doing here, because I don't have a promise, I can return false, right? I'd rather return a rejection so I know I catch the done here.
Yeah.
That's why I did it that way. To me, since that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just feel like in the past we just like I just hit like resolve or reject and pass something into it and it moves on.
Right, but there's no, since I don't have a resolve method here because I'm not returning a promise with a resolve and a reject. I'm in a promise right now, right? So I changed that roster to team roster ID, and now when I add Zach, I get a roster ID and a team ID. Okay, and if I look, let me just clear the database. Well, it's the DB players find. So here he is, ID. It's got a roster ID and it's got a team ID. Now if I do the rosters.find. Right, I should see this C3 and the C3, CD3. So I can tell that I'm connected to the right roster. Okay, so at this point, I've done to player what I did to team, which is when I add a player, I make sure I connect them to the right roster and the right team. But I haven't put myself in the roster yet. So that's sort of the next piece here is to get into the roster. Yes?
Can we go over the logic for line 27 through about 30 again?
Sure.
So it's going into the team model. And it's
Right.
finding
So this dot team.
team ID.
Yeah, so this dot team, when I did this command here, when I posted into it, right? So I'm posting Zach and all of his stuff, and I'm saying his team is this ID. I'm physically saying put him on this team.
Okay.
Okay, so that's a little bit of manual work there. I looked up a team ID, and I'm adding him to that team, right? So then the logic here is find this team, and this dot team is going to be so this dot team. If I don't have one, just reject at hand. Otherwise, I have a team, and I'm going to say for this particular player, his team is going. We're going to save it as team.id, right? The actual team we found, and that actual team we found has a roster on it. So we're going to say this player's roster pointer is the team roster ID. So again, the team we found also has the roster pointer. If you look at the database again, db.teams.find, that team that I connected him to has a roster ID also. So now we're all connected, and it's the same one, right? So the team has this CD3, the player has CD3, and the roster itself is CD3. So we know that we're dealing with, all good stuff here. Okay. But I'm not quite done yet, because now I've got to do what? What's the next thing to do here? Add the player to the roster, right? Hang on one second. Sorry about that. Okay, so at this point we've done our teamwork, right? But I've got to get into another then here, right? I've got to make sure that I can now add a roster. So what I want to do is return promise resolve. So team.roster is not what I really want. So here, just double check one thing with my earlier version here. So once I get that, promise resolve roster, that's what I was thinking. See what I'm doing here is this is the other version I wrote earlier today. So this roster was team roster. And when we return, I'm going to resolve that roster that I find. You see what's going on there? So, yeah, if I promise.resolve team.roster, then gets a roster. So knowing how these promises resolve to each other, right? So again, find by ID, I get a team. Let's assume the happy path here, right? So we're down here. I set my team ID to the team ID. I set the roster ID to the roster ID. But I have a roster, right? Team.roster is a real thing. It's an actual object from the database. So I can resolve that down here. And if I actually go down here and I say console log roster, I should get a roster object. Seriously? Turn true. Just to kind of pass it through. So if I go and remove the player, add the player, here's the roster, right? So it's got an ID and players and all that stuff. It's an actual thing, right? I should be able to save that roster. I should be able to add something to the roster. And there's a little more magic here, which I'll grab out of here, which is this little bit. Copy that and I'll put it in. Put all this in here so we can kind of run through it. Okay, so what I'm doing here is this. We're taking our team, we've assigned ourselves a team and a roster. I'm resolving this .roster, which is my roster ID. So this .roster becomes that ID number, Okay, when I resolve that, it goes down to the next then. And in that then, I'm going to take the roster model, find one, and update it. I'm sending in that roster ID as the lookup. And what I'm going to do is this, add to set players this ID. Okay, so what this does, to find one and update, right, that this becomes the thing that it found. Okay, this $add to set, I believe you guys did post and put, or patch and put, right?
Mhm.
So you remember the $sign set for patch? Do you remember that? No?
He left a message in there. No.
Okay, it's magic. This is some Mongoose magic right here. What this is going to do is going to say it's going to actually run through the array of players, and it's going to add this player, this ID number, to the list of players. Because as you recall, in the roster model, where is it? I keep closing it out. Players is an array, right? It's going to run through and add that player ID to that array if it doesn't already exist. So this is some magic that you get from Mongoose for free. It's going to run through here. It's basically a patch. If you do set, I won't do it here, but if I did $set some object, whatever it was, and that object had throws left or throws right in it, it would only change that one value. So $set is kind of an in-place change. Add to set does that for an array. So this line right here ought to add this player ID number to that roster automatically. Okay, and then we'll resolve it, reject, and we go down to where it's going to do the done stuff. So it should fall right through here. It should say add my player to the roster, or add my team and roster ID to the player. Then find that roster ID and update it by adding this player's ID to the list of players. Okay, so what I expect to see this time, let me go ahead and delete my player. And if I do the rosters.find, I would expect that this players array, this next time will have this player ID in it, and everything else ought to also still be there. So let's delete the player too. So we can always get a clean slate and do Zachary add. And I got a roster ID of CD3, which is good, same thing as before. And if I do the rosters.find, you'll see that now I have myself in this roster list. Right? Is that pretty cool? So the logic was find my team, find the team's roster, add me to the roster. Now I'm all connected. Everything is basically there. If I go back to here and I do the get, where's my ID? I still get a boring player because I haven't done the magic with him yet, right? Remember we did the magic before with the populate? The whole reason why we came here today was to learn populate, right? So let's populate the player when we get him. So we're going to do the same thing for the player that we did for the team. We're going to say player schema.pre find one function done. And we're going to do this dot. This is a little bit different. This dot populate. And we're going to say team. This dot populate. What's the syntax for that? Let's just do team first. We'll kind of grow into this thing. This dot populate team. Let me call it done on that one too. So there's my team. And you'll see that I got a roster on it. I can also do this dot populate should get them both, right? Roster team players. And I could further go in there and actually dive in and have this thing start spitting out names.
So populate gives you everything that's related to that.
Whatever the rel is, whatever the ref is up here, right? So I populated the team, so it gives me the team from the teams that matches this ID. That ref is what ties it all together. And populate is, I'm saying populate this field. Populate this field. I'm giving it no information here. I'm just saying, hey, populate it because you know you have an ID, and we expect some magical things to happen.
Find one is pointing at your get
Yeah.
request.
So again, we'll go back to the player's route. And get players, find one. So before the find one, populate things. Right? That's kind of what we're saying there.
It's like, okay.
Yep. Now I can do something pretty cool here. This.populate. I can make this an object instead. And I believe the path, it's path team. That should, I think, be the same thing. It is. Path.team. Oh. Populate. Path roster. That should do that. So now my team explodes into roster. See how I can nest these in? See how I nested that? So I'm populating my team. So it explodes team out. And within the team, populate the roster path. And now it populated the roster path. Right? And then I can say, and populate path players. And now I get team with a roster with some players. Okay, and if I added more players, right, I can do, let's just go back and add Freddie. That's right. Come on. And he is my shortstop. And I go back and look at this. I get them both. Zach and Freddie both. Right? So now what I've done is I'm able to look at a single player and see what team he's on and who his teammates are. And he's actually included in that. I could go deeper, right? I could actually make this completely circular and go, in my players path, go get the roster. And I can just, you can see scroll this thing down into oblivion here, right? But you can see kind of how that works, right? If I go back to my team model, you'll see that I left a comment in here. And the team model, so if I just get the team, what's the team ID? So the team just gives me a list of players because all I did so far on the team is populate the roster, right? So I can do the same thing for the players, right? If I just change this into an object like you see here, I say team populate path roster.
So, as far as like speed goes, should we consider each one of these populate calls like a call to a server?
Yeah.
Like, so you're kind of tripling your sort of there and back.
It's sort of doing all the. It's like you're teaching how to do a join basically on the inside.
Yeah.
That's what's going on behind the scenes.
I'm just wondering, like, if there's like, should we be careful about doing too many of these if you have a very large database and you're trying to, get a lot of data?
Well, I mean, the point of ID searching is that it's instant. So these ID searches should be basically for free. That's the one index that you get for free in Mongo, right? If you start populating things not by ID and by name or by some random field of text, now you're going to start churning your database, and that's where you want to be careful.
Okay.
So now my team has a roster with players in it. I did the same thing. So if you remember the bag of hangers, this can go as deep as you want. Remember the bag of hangers analogy I gave earlier? Right, so here I'm pulling a team out of the bag, and the team is the most important thing. So I get the team's information first and all of its players. Right, I get the team, the roster, its players. When I pull a player out of the bag of hangers, right, I get the player first, his information, and then I get information about his team, and then further about the roster on the team. So you'll notice that I did this just on the one level with the player. I went populate the team and the roster and then the players on the roster. So I get this sort of, player, team, roster, players. I didn't populate the roster itself. I could have gone through and said player, call this teammates or something and just populate the teammates from that. Then you have a duplicate list, right? This is many to many. It's a graph database, right? Again, you're pulling out the relationships based on these IDs and those references. So again, a lot of setup work, a lot of diving in really to get populate to work. And the way that populate works, again, is that it ties the reference of the table by an ID. Any questions on that?
How much easier is the method you're going to teach us next week?
This is actually the way you do it. Yeah, I mean there's some cheater methods and there's some helpers, other middleware you can do to kind of does this in one step, but this is the way. All right. Well, if that's it, we're 10 minutes early. We can pack her up.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And we're back tomorrow night for lab. Thursday, another lecture. Friday is an optional lecture or lab night. We'll be here to assist. And then, of course, Saturday's lecture lab.
This lab is for tomorrow?
We're doing this lab tomorrow. That's right.
What's it going to be due, though? Do we do before next lecture? You're going to make
Thursday.
Okay.
Yep.
This is gonna be the Thursday.
Yep. Yeah, labs are always due the next lecture day. And because there's a lab day right after the lecture, this is like the day class now, right? This week.
And the